In this week's Technique Tuesday video, I'll demonstrate how to read your stitches when knitting common stitch patterns flat and in the round. If you would like to jump to a specific point in the video, tap or mouse over the video playback area of your screen to reveal the chapter titles and starting points of each section of the video, or use the timestamped links down in the video description. Being able to read your knitting means being able to look at the fabric you've created and to identify what the stitch pattern was that you used to create it. But it also means being able to identify what to do as you work across live stitches that are on the needle. So this is garter stitch, and it's usually the first stitch pattern that knitters learn. And I'm knitting here in rows, so I'll be knitting back and forth. With garter stitch, you really don't have to think very much. As a knitter, you know that what you need to do in order to produce this fabric is to simply knit across all of the stitches every single row. This is stockinette fabric, and it is the fabric that most knitters learn to knit next. So this fabric looks quite different than garter stitch, whereas garter stitch basically looks the same on both sides of the fabric. It is a reversible fabric. Stockinette, or stocking stitch as it's called in some countries, has very different appearance on the front side of the fabric versus the back side. If you look at any column of stitches coming down from one of the live stitches on the needle, you can see that the stitches form a V shape. So this is the smooth side of stockinette. It is the right side of the fabric. This bumpy side is referred to as the wrong side of the fabric. So when you are working stockinette fabric flat, anytime this side of the fabric is facing you, you knit across all of the stitches. But if this side of the fabric is facing you, then this is when you use the purl stitch, and you would purl across all of these stitches. So stockinette fabric is a little bit trickier than garter stitch because you have to be able to identify the two different faces of the fabric and know when to do knits versus when to do purl stitches. So once again, I have stockinette fabric here. You can see the tiny, these are much tinier stitches because I'm working with a finer yarn and tinier needles. But it's still stockinette fabric. You can see those V's on the front and you can see the purl bumps on the back. But this time I'm working in the round. I'm working in a tube, and that means the right side of the fabric is always facing me. And so when I'm working stockinette in the round, all I ever have to do is knit my stitches. I just keep knitting, 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 and this side of the fabric is always facing me. So why is it that when you are working stockinette fabric flat, you have to alternate a knit row with a purl row, but when you're knitting in the round, you knit every round? Well, a purl stitch is the back side of a knit stitch. So every time you're creating a knit, you're also creating a purl. Every time you're creating a purl, you're also creating a knit. You're just creating the same stitch, but from different faces. So let's look at it like this. Let's say that the small letter B represents a knit stitch, and the small letter D represents a purl stitch. When you look at the B from the back side of this, you see the letter D. And when you look at the letter D from the back side, you see the letter B. So let's see what that looks like when you are creating stockinette fabric. So if you create a row of knits across the right side of the work, and then you turn it to work the other side, you're going to do a purl row. So you're creating a row of Ds. Well, that row of knits that you created also looks like a row of Ds. And then when you go back to the next right side row, you're going to create the knits going across. So what you end up with is all of the knit stitches are on one face of the fabric and all of the purl stitches are on the other. That means that when you are knitting in the round and the right side is always facing you, you're going to work the first round as a knit, and then when it's time to work the second round, you're going to work them as knits again, and then on the third round, knits again. And that's why you're always knitting every round with stockinette. So let's look at what happens with garter stitch. When you're working garter stitch flat, you knit every row. So when we turn it over to the other side and we're still knitting another row, you can see that they are opposite from each other with respect to this face of the fabric. That means that when you knit garter stitch in the round, you are going to be, and this side is always facing you, you're going to alternate a round of knits with a round of purls. So how would I know when I put my knitting down and then pick it back up whether I was supposed to be knitting stitches or purling stitches if I'm knitting garter stitch in the round? I look at the stitches that are under the needles, and what I can see is that these stitches that are under the needles have that sort of smooth V look that we saw on the right side of the stockinette. And then under those stitches, you see these little purl bumps. So these stitches present, that means they look like knit stitches. So if I'm working garter stitch in the round, I actually need to purl these stitches in order to create garter stitch fabric. Now, it doesn't matter if you're holding the yarn in your left hand like I am now or holding it in the right hand. You would still enter this stitch from back to front like this, and the yarn will come around the needle and then it will get pulled through. So, so this is working garter stitch in the round. You have to alternate a round of knits with a round of purls. So as I approach the end of the round, I can look to see where the round transitions from the knits to the purls. So I know that because these two stitches present as knits, that I need to purl them for garter stitch. And then once I see that I've got purl bumps directly under the needle, then I know that this is a round where I will knit all of the stitches. So one challenge that many knitters have is trying to tell the difference between garter stitch fabric and the purl side of stockinette fabric, because they can look very, very similar. So the first thing that you do is, if you have the piece, is that you turn it over and you see, well, does it look the same on both sides of the fabric? If it does, then it's garter stitch. But the next thing that you can do is to pull the fabric vertically like this. Because garter stitch, because it's a row of knits on top of a row of purls, when you pull it apart, you can see that right below the needle here, there's this purl bump. That's the head of the stitch that's below the needle. And then you look down here, and there's a stitch right here where you see the two legs, like a stockinette stitch. So you're seeing the legs of this stitch. So that's the purl stitch, and this is the knit stitch, and then there's another purl stitch. So this, you can tell, is garter stitch, where if you look at this fabric, if you were to pull it apart, what you're going to see is just one purl head after another in the same column. You're not going to see any knit stitches in between these two purl stitches there. With stockinette and garter stitch, every stitch of a given row or round is worked exactly the same, whether it's a knit or a purl. But other stitch patterns are not that way. You're mixing your knits and purls. So let's take a look at the simplest knit purl pattern, which is ribbing. So this is a knit one, purl one ribbing. So this means we're alternating knits with purls. So this is a situation where we have to look at how stitches are presenting to us before we knit them. And what we mean by that is not the stitches on the needle. These stitches on the needle are just loops. What we're actually looking at is the row of stitches that is right below the needle. And we're looking for whether these stitches are knits or purls. And so what you can see is you've got a column of knits here, where you have those V's of the stitches, and then you have columns of purls. And because the back side of a knit is a purl and the back side of a purl is a knit, we get the same look on the back side. So this first column of stitches right here is our knits, and if we look at it on the back side, we can see that they're all purls. The second stitch here is a column of knits, and you can see that the second stitch here is a column of purls. But like with garter stitch, it essentially looks the same on both faces of the fabric. So this is a situation where when you see a knit stitch below the needle, you are going to knit it. And when you see a purl bump below the needle, you're going to purl it. And this is going to be true whether you are knitting in the round or knitting flat. That whenever you see a knit stitch, you're going to knit it. And whenever you see a purl stitch, you're going to purl it. So I see this purl bump underneath the needle, and so that means I'm going to bring the yarn in front and I'm going to purl that stitch. Again, it doesn't matter that I'm holding the yarn in my left hand. It matters whether I'm entering it and working it as a knit. So this is a knit stitch, so I'm going to knit it. So once you have established the first row of a ribbing pattern, you don't need to say to yourself, knit one, purl one, knit one, purl one, and then if you stop and you forgot where you are, you don't have to start from the beginning of the row to figure out what you're supposed to do on the next stitch. You just look at what that stitch looks like, and you see that purl bump underneath the needle, and you know that you need to purl that stitch. So with ribbing, you're always working stitches as they present. That means what they look like currently on the needle. And then you can maintain your ribbing pattern. So this is another stitch pattern where you alternate knits and purls across the needle, but you don't work the stitches as they present. So this is called, in the US we call this seed stitch. In the UK this is called moss stitch, and these terms can be confusing because there is a different stitch pattern that's related to this that is called moss stitch in the US that is not this stitch pattern. But what's going on here is that we're alternating knits and purls across the row, but we're also alternating them up and down the columns. So again, this is a stitch pattern where once you have established the first row and you've alternated a knit one with a purl one all the way across the row, from then on, you work the stitches opposite of how they present. So I can see here that I have a purl bump right under the needle, and I can see that the second stitch has that smooth V right underneath the needle. So because this is presenting as a purl stitch, that means I'm going to knit that stitch. So I'm knitting these stitches opposite of how they present. So I have a knit stitch, that means I'm going to purl this stitch. Underneath here I have a purl bump, that means I'm going to knit it. So let's look at what happens after the stitch that's on the needle comes off. I'm going to knit it. When it comes off the needle, then you can see I have that smooth knit stitch under the needle. So we can look at how this stitch pattern works flat and in the round as well. So if we do a knit, purl, knit, purl, oops, opposite. Work knit, purl, and then we turn it over like this, and we work stitches opposite of how they present. This looks like a knit, so we purl it, we go opposite. That works on both sides of the fabric. Everything is opposite regardless of which face of the fabric. So even if you're knitting in the round, however a stitch is presenting, you would always work it opposite when you want to work seed stitch. So this is a stitch pattern that in the US we call moss stitch. In the UK it's often called Irish moss stitch, sometimes it's called double moss. This is a 4-row pattern. So again, you can look at what's right under the needle and you can see that there is a knit, purl, knit, purl. So we're alternating between knits and purls across the row. When you look going up the columns, you're going to be alternating 2 knits, 2 purls, you see 2 knits, and then right under the needle you can see 2 purls. So if you see 2 identical stitches right under the needle, then you know it's time to do them opposite. So I have a purl stitch underneath here, so I'm going to work them opposite. So I see a knit, I'm going to purl it. I see a purl, I'm going to knit it. So now when I go to do the second row or round, regardless of what it is, now we can see that I've got a purl and a purl, but then I've got this single knit right underneath the needle. So for this row, I would work the stitches as they do present. So if it looks like a knit, I knit it. If it looks like a purl, I purl it. So now you can see the rows that I've just completed. You can see I've got the 2 purls and I've got 2 knits right here. So if I were to put my work down and then come back to it and I wasn't sure what I was supposed to do, I would look at the stitches that are right under the needle, the 2 rows, and see if they looked the same or if they were different from each other, so that I would know whether I needed to create a new offset where I would knit the purls and purl the knits, or if I needed to knit them exactly the same. Reading your knitting is an important skill. When you can read your stitches, you can catch mistakes quickly and even prevent them. Once you understand how to read your knitted fabric, you will be less dependent on following the instructions by rote. By paying attention to what stitches look like under your needles and seeing how the stitch pattern plays out in the fabric, you'll be able to knit with more confidence and expand your knitting reading skills to include increases, decreases, and more complex stitch patterns. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.